So I just dropped my Exorcist Believer review, and with that, I have now reviewed the entire Exorcist franchise, at least up until this point anyways. And so I figured it would be appropriate to give you my official ranking video of all 6 Exorcist films. But before we get into it, like always, welcome back to The Haunted Beard, everybody. My name is Jake. It's all horror and thriller movie content on my channel. So listen, do not click that subscribe button unless you want to be haunted by the beard. So kicking things off at number 6, the absolute worst of the worst, the bottom of the barrel. This is probably not a surprise to really anybody who has seen these movies, as this is almost unanimously agreed upon as not only the worst in this franchise, but quite possibly one of the very worst sequels ever, and that is The Exorcist II, The Heretic. And this is almost a movie that I kind of recommend you watch just because it's so atrociously bad, you kind of have to see it to believe it. In addition to this being just a boring, uninteresting slog to get through, it is one of the most ridiculous movies in terms of what they attempt and try to do with the story and how it's conveyed and presented. One of the most just ridiculous and absurd movies I've ever seen. All the stuff with the locusts is still kind of beyond me. I don't really know entirely what they were attempting there. It seems to be that that is somehow the vessel that Pazuzu is using to communicate with the new priest and Reagan through these shared hypnosis sessions, and he's communicating and sharing with them Father Merrin's memories. If that sounds ridiculous, it's because it absolutely is. It's the most just bizarre, absurd thing, and none of it works. And it's a movie that I don't even think is interesting or compelling even in the idea or the concept. It's just a complete and total failure all around, a total misfire. In addition to it being boring and ridiculous, it's devoid of pretty much all suspense or tension. There is very little demonic activity and possession stuff in it up until the very, very end. And even then, it's really not all that great. It's just an absolute nightmare. So, yeah, watch it if you dare. But, yeah, Exorcist II, The Heretic is my number 6. Next up at number 5, and I debated on this for a little bit, but for me right now, number 5 is the latest Exorcist, The Believer. And the main issue I had with this is that it's not an Exorcist movie outside of just simply the fact that it's called The Exorcist. And because they decided to bring Ellen Burstyn, Chris McNeil's, the character name, back into this movie for no other reason than to just simply cash in on the name of The Exorcist. And so to me, this is just the epitome of a cash grab. Her character doesn't need to be in this movie. She's pretty much totally unnecessary in terms of how much she affects or influences the plot. And what they do to her character, I think, is extremely disrespectful, especially if you're trying to honor and respect the original movie, and then you do this to her character. And so in addition of this being a complete unnecessary cash grab, it's just a pretty standard, generic, basic demon possession exorcism movie that we have seen tons and tons of times. It's not very shocking, it's not very scary, it's not very horrific, it doesn't really do anything, again, that we haven't seen many, many times before. And if that's not bad enough, we are unfortunately getting 2 more of these. Now, I do my best to go into any movie with an open mind and having just kind of open expectations and allowing the movie to, speak for itself sort of thing. But man, I have basically no hope for these next 2. And if by some miracle David Gordon Green does something and proves me wrong, I will gladly admit it. But man, I just have no clue what they're going to do with 2 more of these. It's just not looking very good for this franchise, unfortunately. But yeah, that's why Exorcist Believer comes in at number 5. Next up at number 4, and this one barely edged out the previous one, but number 4 for me is Exorcist The Beginning, and really the only reason why this one is a step above the previous one is because this one doesn't completely insult the original film. This one sees Father Merrin in Egypt in 1949, right after World War II, and because of what he experienced with the war, he has now lost his faith. But he is asked to come out to this excavation site as they have uncovered this church that shouldn't be where it is. And much like the previous film on this list, this is just a very generic, seen it a million times before, demon possession type movie. And I think this is a great example of what happens when studio interference gets involved in the vision of the director. As if you know anything about the behind the scenes story, Paul Schrader was originally hired on as the director, and he had a vision and an idea for this movie, but the studio intervened as they didn't like it, and of course they got involved and made it much, much worse. And this turns into, again, just a very standard generic demon possession movie. There wasn't enough demonic stuff, there wasn't enough jump scares, there wasn't enough action, violence sort of stuff in this movie, and so the studio got involved and cranked up the knobs on all those things. And again, if you've seen a demon possession movie, you've seen this. The jump scares in this are the most pathetic, poor, attempted excuses for a jump scare that, again, we've seen millions and millions of times. They're terrible. And by and large, this movie is just really unmemorable. I said in my original review, there's not really a whole lot to say about it because there's just nothing really worth talking about. There's nothing really all that memorable. It's also got some horrifically aged CGI, and I know this is back in 2004, so CGI isn't quite as good as it is today, obviously, but man, if anything dates a movie, it is bad CGI, and this, now 20 years old, basically looks horrible, so that does not do the movie any favors. And yeah, that's really all there is to say about it. There's not really much to talk about. There's not really any reason to watch this. So yeah, the only reason why it's my number 4 is because it doesn't totally insult the original like Exorcist Believer does. So yeah, that's my number 4. All right, coming in at number 3, and I will say, even though this is only one more above the previous movie, we've definitely moved up a tier here. And for my number 3, it is Dominion, prequel to The Exorcist. And because Exorcist The Beginning was a box office failure, the studio figured, what the heck, we'll just release Paul Schrader's movie anyways. And I will give them a little bit of credit, as I'm glad they did. And I might be a little bit higher on this movie than most people, but I actually enjoyed this film. It's by no means a perfect film or a great film at all, but I do think it is pretty good, as this really largely focuses on Father Merrin, played by Stellan Skarsgård, and I think he gives a really solid performance. But this is a character piece and a character-driven film, and is really more of a drama with some kind of horror elements scattered throughout it. But I just found his character really interesting, as Schrader was more focused on his internal struggle and his battle with his faith and what he went through during the war and how that affected his faith in God, and then bringing it back full circle to him rediscovering his faith through the experiences of what happens on this excavation site in Egypt. And so I just found it to be a pretty interesting and compelling story. Yes, it is definitely lighter on the horror, but there is still some demonic stuff in it, but I just really took to the character. I just thought it was an interesting and compelling character study. There's some, I think, interesting and thought-provoking conversations just about, religious stuff and faith and God and stuff like that in there that definitely elevated this a step above the sort of standard generic demon possession type movies. There's definitely still some issues with it. Some of the visuals don't look great. Some of the scenes don't fully come together and work, but I think part of the blame, at least in terms of the visuals, should be put on the studio, because they totally removed Paul Schrader's visual effects budget, at least almost down to zero. So he basically had no money to work with to put in for the visual effects. And so, yeah, it's kind of a bummer. I would have liked and wished that the studio would have fully backed his movie, but as it sits, I still think it's a pretty solid effort overall, and that's why Dominion is my number 3. All right, top 2, and it's probably no surprise what the top 2 are. And before I unveil my number 2, how I typically do my ranking videos are, if I had to put one of the movies on right now, what would be the first one that I would put on? That's my number one, and so on and so forth. So I'm not trying to be objective in terms of like what is the best film, if it's even possible to be objective. It's all just a matter of opinion, of course. But for me, obviously, we have the original Exorcist film and Exorcist 3. And when I take both of those movies, for me personally, I prefer a serial killer murder mystery over a demon possession type movie. That's just kind of my own personal flavor and preference. So for me, my number two is actually the original Exorcist. Now look, of course, this is the more impactful and significant and meaningful and important movie. But again, which one would I put on right now if I had to pick? This would be my second choice. And this was actually a first-time watch for me. I just watched it for the very first time just a couple months ago. And look, it's an incredible movie. It's amazing how well it holds up 50 years later in terms of the scares, and just the effectiveness of those exorcism scenes are really, really impressive, and they still hold up fantastically well. This movie is still today genuinely disturbing and shocking and unsettling, and it's just very, very memorable. But also, too, it does a really good job with creating good characters and a good story around all of it, as really Father Karras kind of becomes our main protagonist, and we're kind of seeing the movie through his eyes, at least a good degree of the movie, and just kind of seeing him and his battle and his struggle with faith. And then you've got really the dynamic of the mother-daughter relationship there, which brings in a lot of kind of emotions and drama and stuff like that. And I think the ending in this is absolutely fantastic. I think it's just terrific. If you want some more of my thoughts on the ending, go back and watch my live reaction to the Exorcist video, as I really kind of get into it and flesh out some of my thoughts on it. But I think the ending is just phenomenal. Look, this is, I mean, what can I say about this that hasn't been said already? It's maybe the most important, and it's one of the greatest horror movies ever made, and everything that has been made since then owes probably some debt of gratitude to the original Exorcist. It's phenomenal. I think it's a great movie, and I greatly admire it and respect it. But my personal preference and my number one is The Exorcist 3. And as I said, just my personal flavor gears more towards that kind of serial killer murder mystery. And that's really what this is. And I just love the completely different direction that William Peter Blatty takes this. And this is another case also of a little bit of studio meddling and interference, as Blatty didn't even really want this to be called an Exorcist movie. He wanted it to just be called Legion. So that's really the big reason as to why this is very different than any of the other Exorcist films, but I just love it for that. I think the character work in here is awesome. I think George C. Scott, his performance is really great, and his character is also really good. The dynamic that is established between him and his friend earlier on in the movie, I think they do just a really good job with that. I like the setting in the hospital. And it's got, of course, one of the greatest, maybe the greatest jump scare of all time with the hallway shot. That's just awesome. And this movie does a great job with being very creepy and unsettling, with having very little blood and gore in it. And, I mean, for a movie to be able to be that unsettling and creepy without getting very graphic at all just speaks to just the writing and the directing and everything. Just the atmosphere is really solid too. And I can't talk about Exorcist 3 without talking about Brad Dourif, because oh my goodness, I don't even know how to put into words how much I thoroughly enjoyed watching his performance in this movie. And he is absolutely phenomenal. And this may be a bold claim, but you know what? It's what I think. So I'm going to just say it. I think Brad Dourif deserves to be mentioned alongside of people like Anthony Hopkins in Silence of the Lambs and Kevin Spacey in Seven. He's just fantastic. He absolutely kills this movie in the best possible way. It's just awesome. I don't know what else to say. I can sing his praises up to high heaven forever. He's just awesome in this movie, and I love it. So that is my ranking of the Exorcist movies. That is all I have for you today. Thank you for joining me. Hit me up down below, though, like always. Let me know your ranking. Would love to hear from you. Again, thank you so much for watching. I greatly appreciate it, and I'll see you next time on The Haunted Beard.